For better or for worse, we are all too familiar with hand sanitizer and disinfection nowadays. But have you ever read the label on your hand sanitizer? Does it really kill 99.9% of germs? Who are those 0.1%? All of this and more on today's episode of The Secret Life of Numbers. Welcome to the Secret Life of Numbers podcast, the podcast where we dissect everyday numbers and statistics to find the stories behind them.
Each episode, we take a number or statistic and break it down. We will tell you where it comes from and what it means for you. Along the way, hopefully we will inspire you to think about the numbers in your own life.
I'm Levannia, your data scientist on call. I'll be breaking down the numbers.
I'm Lindsay, your data translator. For when Levannia gets too technical on us, I'll be breaking down the rest.
All right, let's jump in.
So, Levannia.
Yes, Lindsay?
This is one of the most exciting episodes.
Well, I think it's quite relevant, but it's also our first episode.
Hello, world. We're here, and we're so excited to share what we've been working on.
Yeah, I'm excited.
Me too. Today's episode, as you probably guessed from our opening questions, is all about hand sanitizer, which has really become everyone's best friend during the pandemic.
Yep, I carry it in my purse. I have it on a shelf right by the door so I don't forget it when I leave. There's some in the car.
Hand sanitizer is like the new chapstick. Like you have like a purse sanitizer, you have a home sanitizer, you have a car one.
It's just everywhere. Yeah.
But we have a question. Do hand sanitizers really kill 99.9% of germs? Which germs? How do we know this? 99.9 seems a little too convenient. So we decided to do some digging and see what the story is behind this claim.
Let's start with the numbers bit. I'm going to be going over how we actually test how these germs or how these disinfectants are evaluated. But first, Lindsay, do you want to start us off with a definition of germs?
Germs is the least specific microbiology term.
I know.
So I did a quick little Google, as the kids do, of where did we the youngins. Where did the word germ even come from? And what's its actual versus colloquial or everyday definition? So via Wikipedia history, pathogen was one of the first kind of microbiology terms coined, and it essentially means any agent that could cause disease. And it's also called a germ. So germ is incredibly broad, right? In microbiology, we have all these different groups, really. There's bacteria, there's viruses, which we are very familiar with now. But there's also protozoa, which are larger microorganisms that have organelles in them. So little compartments and pouches that have their own membrane around them.
And have specific duties.
Exactly. A lot of them are parasitic as well. Not all, but some of them. Like, if you've ever had beaver fever, you've had a protozoa. And then we have one of the most kind of weird and wonderful groups, and that is prions.
Oh, yes. These are super interesting because they can travel through your digestive system without being broken down.
Yes. So prions are proteins that are misfolded, and then they induce other proteins to misfold like them. So when you're making a protein in your body, well, you aren't consciously making it, but when your cells are making proteins, folding is a really important part. You can kind of think about it as like origami. And an example of prions is mad cow disease. And then we also have fungi that are microorganisms. So yeast, for example. Germ kind of encompasses a lot of things and is fairly nonspecific.
Yeah, so I guess a germ is all of these things. It's a virus, it's a bacteria, it's a protozoa, it's a fungi. It's just a catch-all term.
Exactly. And I think, too, at the time that we first started coining these terms, we didn't know about all of the groups.
So now that we have an idea of what a germ is, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the regulations surrounding the numbers that are placed on these hand sanitizers or on these disinfectants. So in Canada, we have Health Canada that does this regulation. And in the US, it's the US Environmental Protection Agency, or EPA, that outlines these regulations for us. And the way they test these disinfectants or sterilizers is through something called carrier testing. And we'll go through what carrier testing is in broad strokes, but I'm still a little confused as to how we got to 99.9% of germs. Because as we talked about, germs is this broad umbrella, but in all of these tests, you're testing very specific organisms. For example, Pseudomonas aeruginosa, Staphylococcus aureus, and Salmonella enterica are like 3 examples.
Salmonella enterica.
Salmonella enterica are 3 examples.
That's all you learn in a microbiology undergrad is how to pronounce these terms, because they're quite a mouthful. So if you happen to kind of miss those ones, that's okay. The gist of it is that we're testing 3 pretty specific microbes.
Yeah, or any of these tests will be very specific to some microbes.
Yeah, because if you think about the diversity of microorganisms in the world, like we're still finding new microorganisms. There's more and more and more out there as our techniques are getting better at finding ones that you can't culture and grow. So it's impossible to test all of them.
So yeah, once again, I'm a little suspicious about 99.9% of germs. Let's just do an overview in broad strokes of one of these procedures. So the one we're going to look at is the standard operating procedure for disinfectant towelette test, testing of Staphylococcus aureus. Lindsay, do you want to take this one here? Pseudomonas
aeruginosa
and Salmonella
enterica.
Awesome.
My microbiology undergrad is finally being put to good use.
Okay, so this is what we call a carrier test. So you can think of the carrier as carrying the disinfectant. So in many cases, the carrier is like a metal cylinder or a metal square, for example, and you prep the carrier with the disinfectant as per the instructions on the packaging of your towelette.
Okay.
And then you have to grow cells of these specific strains of bacteria that we described earlier, and they have to reach like a certain concentration in their growth media. And what you'll do then is you incubate the carrier with the cells, and then after an incubation period, also based on the instructions on the packaging, you remove the carrier, dry it off, then incubate the carrier to see if there's any bacteria left on it.
So the carrier carries the disinfectant.
Yes.
And then it encounters the microbes that you've been growing.
Yes.
And then you see if anything's grown on the carrier.
Exactly.
Okay. Got it.
Yeah. Like different regulations have different amounts of carriers that you need to test. This particular one says a single test involves the evaluation of 60 inoculated carriers for one organism.
So in our test where we're testing those 3 bacteria, you would need to do 180.
Yes, 60 for each. And then those are just the inoculated carriers. There are other carriers as well. Like you need a control carrier, for example, and you need like a sterility control as well. So they're minimum, I've seen that you need 72 carriers per test.
Per microbe, right?
Per microbe, yes.
Okay, got it.
I guess you're wondering, how do we pass this test?
Yes. Where's the cheat sheet? How do we get through?
Once they've done that second incubation, to see if there's anything growing on the carrier, they'll look at that incubation media and they'll test it for turbidity. And turbidity just means how cloudy it is. So if it's turbid, that means that bacteria is growing. If it's not turbid, then nothing is growing. And a passing test is 0 or 1 of the 60 are turbid.
Okay, so if we have 2 that are turbid out of the 60, you fail the test.
You fail the test.
Okay.
Other fails can be like if your viability controls didn't grow bacteria, for example, because then that could be an indication that no bacteria was growing to begin with.
Right. You did a boo-boo and nothing was growing and your disinfectant might not actually work.
That's just like a lab test to make sure you conducted your experiment correctly.
Yeah, you always want to have that positive
Hmm.
control to make sure, in this case, that whatever you're growing is actually growing. And you
Yes,
didn't forget to put in the food or something. And then a negative control to make sure that your carriers weren't already contaminated. Or,
exactly.
yeah.
The last bit is a confirmation step. So you'll confirm a certain number of these incubated carriers to make sure that the bacteria isn't growing. Like you'll confirm for the specific type of bacteria to make sure it was in fact killed.
So you're just double checking that the ones that weren't turbid don't actually have bacteria.
Yeah.
Interesting. So my question is, how do we get to 99.9% of germs out of, I don't know, 0 to 1 out of 60 are growing bacteria?
I'm not sure. And if anyone of our listeners knows, you can for sure email us or send us a message. But I mean, 1 on 60 is not 0.1%, right? It's like 1.6%.
Maybe it's averaged out because you
Mm,
do 60 for each, and then maybe two have
maybe.
0.
I don't know. But I mean, for sure, if you're not turbid and you can confirm that that bacteria is killed or the disinfectant has killed the bacteria, then you can be pretty sure that of that bacteria, you've killed a large portion of it. But once again, it's just like one bacteria that you tested, not 99.9% of germs.
Right. I think the fact that they use the word germ, I feel very comforted when I hear that 99.9% of germs are killed, especially during a pandemic, because I'm like, this is
Mhm.
great. It kills COVID. Perfect. I'm happy. But this testing for Purell, for example, that's on like bottles that you bought before, depending on when in the pandemic,
Mhm.
it wouldn't have been tested on a novel coronavirus that we didn't know we had.
Yes, exactly. Something to note is like these tests, as I mentioned, are extremely controlled. So you need to be following the instructions on your sanitizers or on your towelettes to like a T to get the same level of efficacy.
So when you walk into the store and they have DIY hand sanitizer that's the consistency of vodka, and you squirt that on your hands and it just kind of dribbles through, and you're like, good enough, and you wipe it on your jeans.
You might not be killing everything you need to kill.
Interesting. Interesting. So maybe somehow in the lab they are getting 99.9%, although they're not
Yes.
disclosing that calculation.
Yeah, I'm not exactly sure how it's coming about. We've talked a little bit about what's a germ and the different types of germs, and also how some of our disinfectants are evaluated by organizations like the EPA. After the break, Lindsay's going to come back and teach us about the skin microbiome and how we pick a hand sanitizer.
Welcome back, everyone. So before the break, we went over all things to do with testing. But at the end of this, what should we actually be looking for when we're at the store and we're trying to choose a hand sanitizer?
Yeah, how does all of this information translate into what we need to do in the grocery store or the pharmacy?
Or the distillery during COVID?
Wherever you purchase your hand sanitizer.
Yes. So I consulted the CDC. They maintain really good information that's very kind of accessible to the public. It's a great place to go if you want evidence-based resources.
Yes.
And the CDC wants you to have at least 60% alcohol in your hand sanitizer.
Okay. So alcohol being ethanol?
They cite a bunch of studies that support alcohol-based hand sanitizers between 60 to 95% are more effective than those that have either a lower concentration than 60% or don't contain any alcohol at all.
Mm.
The gist of it is that without this concentration of alcohol in the hand sanitizer, we might not be seeing that same coverage of different germs, and the hand sanitizer might not be actually getting rid of the germs and killing them, but just
Hmm.
lowering their numbers.
Okay. How does a hand sanitizer that doesn't have any alcohol in it work?
That is an extraordinarily good question. There are hand sanitizers without alcohol. Some of them might have essential oils that have some antimicrobial action.
Okay. But the CDC recommends 60 to 90% alcohol.
Exactly. And I think the question on everyone's minds nowadays is, does this hand sanitizer work against COVID-19?
Yes.
We now have a lot more information about COVID-19, and we have more studies about what works against it and what doesn't. The Government of Canada actually maintains a list of different disinfectants and hand sanitizers that work against COVID-19 and are authorized by Health Canada. We'll have a link in our show notes if you want to check if your hand sanitizer stacks up or if you're in the market for a new one.
You can just go shopping for your favorite hand sanitizer on the list.
I think we've seen some really interesting trends with hand sanitizer with COVID-19 because I don't think the world was really ready for what was coming.
It was certainly becoming more ubiquitous. After SARS, you saw hand sanitizer like beside the elevator, for example, like after you push the elevator button. But like now it's just everywhere.
For better or for worse. Probably for better when we're in the middle of a pandemic. But a question that comes up all the time when you start talking about hand sanitizer is, which is better, hand sanitizer or hand washing?
My knowledge of this, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, is that hand sanitizer just kills the bacteria or the germs, let's say, on your hands, but it doesn't remove them. Hand washing does both.
Yes, that's the gist of it, is because with using a hand sanitizer, you don't have running water washing things away. It's just there. But the thing is, once an organism is killed, is it still pathogenic? Probably depends on the microbe, but not all microorganisms are killed by hand sanitizer. So during COVID, we've probably all learned a little bit more than we've ever wanted to know about hand washing. Remember, sing happy birthday twice. To answer this question, I again went to the CDC, and they have a really great page that breaks down pros and cons of hand washing versus hand sanitizer. So I thought we would just hit the highlights.
Give me the highlights.
Okay.
It's like a sporting event for hand washing.
The gist of it is, like we talked about, hand sanitizer doesn't eliminate all the different types of germs, especially when people aren't using either enough hand sanitizer
or using it appropriately.
Exactly. They're not doing proper hand hygiene. They're not getting all the nooks and crannies. They aren't letting it dry on their hands instead of rubbing it on their jeans. And like I mentioned, soap and water are also better at removing some kinds of germs that we encounter. So a few examples of this is Cryptosporidium, norovirus, and the heavy hitter, Clostridium difficile, or as it's colloquially referred to, C. diff. And C. diff is a really important one because it is especially rampant at times in hospitals.
Yes, and also, as I recall, it's pretty difficult to kill.
Yes, but hand washing washes it away and you're good. But if you're just using alcohol-based hand sanitizer, you're not getting it the way it needs to be get. And the thing with C. diff is that it's really an infection that kind of preys on people that are already in a vulnerable health state.
That's why it's such a problem in hospitals.
So very important to wash your hands with soap and water if that's available. But in general, using hand sanitizer is better than not using anything at all if you're concerned that you just touched something that's really gross. So one other thing is that hand sanitizer is not as good as hand washing if your hands are visibly soiled, because like we talked about with the microbes, it's not really washing things off. And then a final thing about hand sanitizers is they can't always remove what's on our hands because it's not just microbes that we're concerned about. So, for example, there might be pesticides or heavy metals or different chemicals that we're, wanting to remove from our hands, but hand sanitizer might not be the one for that because, again, we're not actually having that action of washing it away with water.
I see. If hand sanitizer is the only option that you have available to you for whatever reason, I did find an article that kind of helps us pick an ideal disinfectant. So they have a couple things that they list. So you want it to be broad spectrum, so killing many different types of bacteria, viruses, germs, that the entire umbrella. You want it to be fast acting as well. It needs to remain wet because most of the time a lot of those disinfectants are not, after they dry, they're no longer working, and they can't be affected by environmental factors. It should be active in the presence of organic matter, for example, blood. Should be non-toxic, should be surface compatible. It should be persistent, so it should have sustained antimicrobial activity, easy to use, have an acceptable odor, economically priced, soluble, stable, and non-flammable. These are just some of the things that you're looking for.
Very important. It's funny that you mentioned that kind of list of all those things to look for, because I found a whole body of literature on like what's the ideal hand sanitizer in different settings.
Okay.
Which is kind of a fun area of science to look into.
If ever you're interested and you want to know.
A lot of the studies have been done in healthcare settings, because that's one of the places where it is really important to be using something antibacterial. As we mentioned, for hospital-acquired infections, because even though C. diff isn't our ideal target for alcohol-based hand sanitizers, other microbes are.
Yes.
So I found a study done about the best types of hand sanitizers for healthcare worker compliance. They looked at different forms and doses, they call it. So they compared foams, gels, and liquids.
I don't know about you, but I like the gel.
Oh, I am gel all the way. Foam feels like it's not doing anything, and liquid is like, it just falls on your shoes.
Yeah, I can't control the liquid ones. Gel all the way.
We are gel girls for hand sanitizer. And the different doses they looked at were 0.7, 1.5, and 3 mils. They found some very interesting results because they looked at a lot of different aspects of, what's causing people to use it more, what's turning people away. So they found that the lower doses of 0.7 or 1.5 mils were people's favorites, because 3 mil was just, as they say, harder to wield.
Is it 3 mils for both hands or 3 mils per hand?
That's a great question. I'm going to guess it's 3 mils per pump. Like, you get 3 mils, you use it on both hands. One thing they found, which as someone who prefers gels is a little sad, the foam and gel formulations became sticky at high doses. So at that 3 mil.
I have encountered this before. It leaves a residue on your hands.
So as far as a sensory experience goes, people enjoyed liquids. But the fact that they were so hard to handle, again, the phenomenon of most of the hand sanitizer ending up on your shoes, really canceled out the sensory experience for those.
I see.
So overall, from this study, they concluded that foams and gels are preferred to liquids, and the overall favorite dose was 1.5 milliliters.
Okay.
In case you ever wanted to know what the ideal dose of hand sanitizer is.
But this is ideal for comfort, not necessarily ideal for killing germs.
Yeah, this is more from, as a healthcare worker in a healthcare setting, what deters you from using it? What, do you look for in the hand sanitizer that you're using? Because ultimately, hand sanitizer can be the most perfect for application, but if no one uses it because it dries out their hands, or it's too hard to wield, or it doesn't leave you feeling clean and it's really sticky, and people don't use it, it doesn't really matter how good it is. It's only as good as when people use it.
Exactly. Okay.
So as far as hand sanitizer goes, there are people that are concerned about different risks with different ingredients in hand sanitizer, which I think is valid. It's important that we look into these things, that we check to make sure that what we're putting on our skin, especially things that are absorbing really quickly, are safe to use. And that's one of the great things about the Health Canada list that's maintained. But I found an interesting, again, little niche of literature on possible risks to do with hand sanitizer.
Okay.
And there was one study in particular that I can't do this episode without mentioning.
All right. Hit me. I'm ready.
So I have a very important question.
Yes.
Have you ever put on hand sanitizer and then touched a thermal receipt?
Probably. I mean, like at the grocery store, I put on hand sanitizer and then she hands me my receipt.
Exactly. So, do you ever notice that the receipt changes color a little bit?
Yes, it can turn like blackish where your my thumbprints are.
Yes. Okay, so there's a study that wanted to look into this because thermal receipt paper contains BPA, or bisphenol A. There's a lot of concerns about BPA in the environment and different plastic water bottles, and in general, people are trying to avoid it. So one of the things that's really interesting is for thermal receipts, BPA is used as a print developer. So it helps develop what's printed on the receipt. And hand sanitizer enhances skin penetration of different compounds that it carries.
Okay.
This study wanted to know, what are the effects of holding thermal receipt paper and eating food post hand sanitizer application, and their outcome measure, or what they were looking for, was urine levels of BPA.
Okay. So they're wondering, if you use hand sanitizer, touch a receipt, and then eat, are you absorbing the BPA from the receipt?
Exactly.
Okay.
And the general consensus was, yes, there's a bit more BPA that's found in your urine. But I think the way that they did this study was so interesting, because I just imagine being an undergrad at the university that this was conducted on and seeing this study. So what they did is they had participants for quite a few hours or days before, they weren't allowed to touch anything that had BPA in it.
Okay.
So they had to be careful with like food takeout containers and stuff like that. And then what they had participants do is they had to put on hand sanitizer, touch a thermal receipt to get BPA on their hands, and then they had to touch French fries.
And then eat the French fries?
They had to touch the French fries, eat the French fries, and then they checked urine BPA levels.
I mean, it's like a free meal out of the study.
Well, I was like, if I was on this campus and I saw that I could get study credits for eating French fries and using hand sanitizer, sign me up.
How long did they hold the receipt?
Okay, so their data showed that when you hold the receipt for 60 seconds after using hand sanitizer, 185 times more BPA was transferred to your wet hand than if you weren't using hand sanitizer.
Okay.
But one of the things is that the amount that's transferred normally is extremely low to begin with.
Yes. I mean, is it dangerous, this level that's transferred?
So before you go out and stop getting receipts or using hand sanitizer, the point of this study wasn't to say that, oh, this level of BPA after eating French fries and holding a thermal receipt is toxic for you. It's just to show that dermal, which refers to your skin, absorption of BPA is possible, really, like is a route for BPA, because a lot of studies looking at BPA ingestion are concerned more with gastric, so like your digestive tract, and they don't look at dermal absorption as much. So the purpose of this study was really to show that, not to freak anyone out about BPA levels with receipts. I think it's such a niche event. And if you are concerned about it, which we don't want to concern anyone, something you could do is wait another second before putting on your hand sanitizer after visiting a store, and just put the receipt in your purse or pocket first, and then not worry about it as much.
So, Lindsay, we've talked about hand sanitizers and disinfectants killing bad or pathogenic bacteria or germs on your hands, but is there a flip side? Are there good bacteria on your hands as well?
This is my favorite topic.
I knew it would be.
For those of you that don't know, I think I mentioned in this episode already, but I did my undergrad in microbiology, and microbes are, to me, what numbers are to Levannia.
Yes.
There's a whole world, and you're never alone because your microbes are always with you.
So microbes are your love language and numbers are my love language.
Exactly. So there's this wonderful book, and it's called The Whole Body Microbiome. It's written by Brett Finley and Jessica Finley, who both have PhDs, and it's a father-daughter duo, which I think is so sweet. And Brett Finley is professor and researcher at UBC. Each chapter of the book is a different part of the body, and then it walks through all the current research on what we know about the microbiome in that area. So for this episode, I read up on the chapter all about skin, because you're totally right. We get bacteria on our skin, or microbes in general, all the time that are bad, for example, right? Like if you have COVID on your skin, Not good. We also have, like you mentioned, really good bacteria on our skin and good microbes that help us and help take care of us. And they have a lot of different roles. So to give a general overview without getting into the nitty-gritty, some of the microbes on our skin can help reduce wrinkles. They help protect us from infection because they'll occupy space on your skin so that pathogenic bacteria or bacteria that could be harmful can't take up that space. So they kind of like push them out. They help train our immune system. And one thing that was super interesting in this chapter is they talked about how our right and left hands have fairly unique microbiomes.
Huh.
For people, especially that aren't ambidextrous, we tend to do different things with our right and left hands. They quoted a study that found that only 17% of microbes between your right and left hand are the same.
That is very interesting. There's a lot of difference. And your hands touch each other too, so.
I thought that was really interesting because I never thought, I knew that we had a microbiome on our skin and that the microbiome on different parts of our skin would be different. Like it makes sense that the microbes that are on your hand might not be identical to the ones
on your face. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But I never thought of the fact that between your two hands, they could be different. The recommendation of this book, which admittedly was written pre-COVID, was to avoid using antibacterial products unless you're in situations where, for example, you're visiting the hospital or it's part of your infection control at your job or you're in the middle of a global pandemic.
Yes.
And it's in everyone's best interest. But if we do use antibacterial products in general too often, it can disrupt our skin microbiome and cause irritation.
Mm.
In general, we kind of associate hygiene with sterility, which isn't really accurate anymore, knowing what we know about the microbiome in different parts of our body, because we don't actually want to achieve zero microbes.
We don't actually want 99.9%.
So what we want is we want to eliminate the bad ones that are causing harm, bolster the good ones, and keep that balance. But that's easier said than done. So everyone, it's time for what could be considered the cheesiest part of our show, but I think is also our favorite.
Oh, of course it's our favorite, but we're both pretty cheesy ourselves.
Yes. So it's time to plant what we call our science seed. So each episode, we like to give our listeners something to think about, a science nugget to help you think more critically about the numbers and statistics that you hear every day. And today's science seed is all about lab versus life. So here to take it away, Levannia.
Yeah. The difference that we wanted to talk about is exactly what you said. What happens in the lab is not what happens in real life, because your lab is very controlled. You have timers everywhere. There are procedures you're following. There's this difference between efficacy and effectiveness. Efficacy is the performance of an intervention under ideal conditions. So that's your lab. And that's how these disinfectants are evaluated. But then effectiveness is the performance of an intervention under real-world conditions. So when you're slapdashing your hand sanitizers, that's the effectiveness.
Right. So when they're carefully putting the towelette on the carrier plate, there is your efficacy. But as you said, when you're like in the store, you have 5 things in your hand and you're just trying to put some hand sanitizer on, there's your effectiveness.
But it's important to keep that in mind, because when you're using these products, in order to get their efficacy, or in order for them to be effective, equivalent to their efficacy, you need to have some conscious application. Thanks for listening to our first episode, everyone. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, or wherever you find your podcasts. You can find the references we used for this episode in our show notes. A special thank you to Julian Bertino, who does our sound editing and music.
Have an idea of what number we should cover next? Want to learn more about what we talked about this episode? Follow us on Instagram at The Secret Life of Numbers.
We'll catch you next time on The Secret Life of Numbers, where the numbers can run,
but they can't hide.